Hi there, everybody. This is Queso from the Queso You Didn't Know show. Joining me, as always, is the beautiful.
Roberto Simpson.
We got a hell of a show for you today, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, anyone that's into a badass action movie that just needs to be made. Who are we talking about, you ask? We are talking about Yasuke, the African samurai. Now, if you look at the history of Japan in the late 16th century, the Senkoku Jidai, or the Age of Warring States, you expect certain archetypes. You expect samurais in lacquered armor. You expect Buddhist monks burning incense. You expect castles and katanas. What you do not expect, what feels like a glitch in the historical matrix, is a 6'2" African man standing next to the most powerful warlord in Japan, holding his sword. This is not anime. This is not fan fiction. This is the documented historical reality of the man we know as Yasuke. His story is one of the most singular anomalies in global history. It was a story of collision. It is the moment where the tribal societies of East Africa, the expansive maritime empire of Portugal, and the brutal meritocracy of feudal Japan all crashed into each other in a single room in Kyoto in 1581. For 3 years, this man, who likely started life as a captive in the Indian Ocean slave trade, navigated the highest echelons of Japanese military society. He dined with Oda Nobunaga. And if that name sounds familiar, this is the guy that wiped all of the ninja out off of this planet at the time, and it is believed Yasuke would have been in attendance with him when this took place. Well, Nobunaga is known as the Great Unifier. He fought in the most treacherous betrayal in Japanese history at Honaji, and Yasuke disappeared into the mist, leaving behind a legacy that has been debated, romanticized, and mythologized for 450 years. But who was he really? Was he a samurai in the technical sense? Was he a slave? Was he a bodyguard? Or was he something else entirely? A soldier of fortune, swept up in the first wave of globalization. Today we're going to strip away the pop culture veneer. We are going to look at the primary sources, the Shinsho Kokai, the Jesuit letters, the diaries of samurai contemporaries, and we are going to reconstruct the journey of the Obsidian Samurai from the savannas of Africa to the burning temples of Kyoto. This is the story of the man who crossed three oceans to become a legend.
I really like how this shows the melting pot that history has always been, you know, across time. There's always been moments in history where cultures would spill over into one another. There's always a notion, I think, that spread that prior to a certain time, all cultures really lived in a really singular world, basically, where nothing else existed outside of your immediate area, especially nothing outside of your continent. But this is definitely something that dispels that theory, and really, this isn't even the oldest example of that happening, by far.
Exactly. You do have the Silk Road and things like that, but on a even more macro scale, you start seeing because when did Columbus sail the ocean blue? 1492. The weirdest thing is once that happened, people think that globalization is this new thing or something that's only happened in the last 1800 years. And that may be true for the whole of America and South America and Australia and Asia and Africa and Europe. But really, by 1492, yeah, you didn't have Australia in the mix, but you started seeing the world come together in such a fast pace that, like you said, globalization really isn't anything new. It's just something that took a long time to get to where we know it today.
I kind of, I'm not gonna lie, for a minute, I thought that this story would be a tad bit older, but just the fact that it's not, it still shows me that even past the time that the black samurais that I know of existed, it was still a carrying tradition.
Well, and
a lasting.
you'll start seeing how isolated Japan truly was. That's the big thing that plays into this, that the world was coming a lot closer, a lot faster, and for a long. I mean, even after this period, like when we talked about Saigo Takamori and stuff, Japan was super into isolationism, and that's why they didn't want to invade Korea and things like that. That you see this weird structure that they're on this island, they don't really mess with the other countries on a sense outside of war occasionally. That it really was this weird collision of worlds that come together. And it is the first time it really has happened. At least as far as we know on official imperial documents, Yasuke is not only the first black samurai, but he's also the first non-Japanese samurai in their histories.
You know? So, first of all, before we take off, nice with a little rhyming rhyme cadence. The when did Christopher Columbus sail the ocean blue, 1492? I don't know if that was intentional or not, but
That's how they
very
taught it
well
to us in
played.
school. Yes, yes. Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. Yeah, we had to learn that in like fourth grade where I was at school.
Damn, that's nice. And all in all, understanding the fellow Yasuke gets done how.
Well, to really understand Yasuke, we first have to understand how a man from Africa ends up in Japan in 1579. This wasn't a direct flight. This was a journey through the Habshi Diaspora. The term Habshi comes from Al-Habash, the Arabic word for Abyssinia or Ethiopia. In the Indian Ocean world, in places like the Deccan Sultanates of India, the Gujarat and Bengal, Africans weren't just chattel slave used for labor. They were elite military slaves. They were mercenaries. They were admirals. They were kingmakers. Unlike the Atlantic slave trade, which stripped people of their humanity and reduced them to tools, the Indian Ocean trade offered elevated, capable men chances to become capable of earning positions of power. A Habshi slave could own property. He could command armies. He could overthrow his master and become a sultan, as Malik Ambar did in India around the same time. Yasuke likely came from this tradition. The Jesuits, specifically the Italian aristocrat Alessandro Valignano, didn't just pick up a random field hand to take to Japan. Valignano was the visitor of missions, essentially the CEO of the Jesuit enterprise in Asia. And for anyone that doesn't know, Jesuits are a root off of the Catholic religion. They are Catholics, and they're the ones that go out and do a lot of the mission work trying to get other people into Catholicism. He was traveling through a Japan torn apart by civil war. The roads were infested with bandits, Nobushi. The seas were ruled by pirates, Wako. He needed security. He needed missionary muscle. Yasuke was likely purchased or hired in Goa, the Portuguese capital in India, specifically for his martial aptitude. This is important later, both these things, and his imposing physical stature. He was not, and I repeat, was not a servant carrying luggage. He was a bodyguard. But where was he from? The theories are fascinating. The most common is Mozambique. The Makua or Yao people of the interior were being traded by the Portuguese. Yasuke might be a Japanese phonetic attempt to say Yao Suke, the guy from Yao. Or it might be Isufo, Joseph. Another theory points to Ethiopia, the source of the classic Habshi warrior. Yasake, Isaac. A more modern, provocative theory, though, suggests he might have been Dinka from South Sudan. Why? Because of his height. Japanese records state that he was 6 shaku 2 sun, about 6'2". In 16th century Japan, where the average height was maybe 5'2", he was a giant, a titan, and Nobunaga later suspected, this is the fun, weird parts of history, suspected his skin was painted with ink, a description that aligns with the intense pigmentation and ritual ash usage of the Nilotic peoples. However, and whatever his specific ethnicity happens to be, by the time he stepped off the boat in Kyushu in 1579, he was already a survivor of the brutal Karara de India. He was a cosmopolitan man who had seen more of the world than any Japanese warlord. And let me end this by prefacing one of the craziest parts about this story is we truly don't even know the man's real name. Yasuke was a name given to him by Nobunaga.
Nice, nice little nugget of knowledge. I'll start off with that because that's definitely something that I wasn't privy to. That I was privy to the fact that there was an Atlantic Ocean slave trade and an Indian Ocean slave trade, but didn't, I wasn't familiar to the fact or privy to the fact that in the Indian Ocean slave trade, it wasn't chattel slavery.
It really is like crazy to look at the difference in the two slave trades. And you think about the fact that these men, like I said, owned property. They had wives, they had children, they had houses, they had jobs that actually weren't just jobs. They were commanding people, commanding armies. They were being seen for their worth. And I think that is incredible that there was that opportunity. Now, that's not to say it happened every time, because as you know, with the history of Brazil, Portugal didn't necessarily always send people to the Indian Ocean, and it wasn't always so great. But it is just wild to think and read on how different these two triangles of trade actually worked on opposite sides of the world.
Before I pivot off to more about this guy in particular, it's kind of making me think because I speak at least often about how just throughout the slave trade, it's just a coin flip chance, or in some cases, like a loaded dice type of chance towards me going, towards a lot of us going towards certain places or living in certain places based off of where our ancestors were traded off to. Like, and it was more of a chance to end up somewhere in the Caribbeans or some shit. But who's to say that somewhere down the line, people that me or the next person could be related to then get sold off somewhere towards the Indian slave trade? You know, it's just it's just one of those things that make you think it's just a coin flip of a chance,
And how
towards certain
different
things happening.
and how different the next 500 years of your family history would be then. Or the
Right,
next
right.
200, 300, however much it is. Yeah, how different you could be cousins, brothers, aunts, uncles, like you're saying, and one goes this way, one goes that way, and the trajectory is just night and day.
Because if you've seen a lot of Indian people, which I'm sure you have, I mean, their features speak for themselves. And yeah, a lot of that comes from the fact that if you go towards the ancient history, to be all the way scholarly about it, Sir Tutmosis III, an Egyptian pharaoh, and by his statuettes, like he's clearly a black guy. He he conquered India for a bit and colonized it, and yeah, I'm sure that has a lot to do with the bloodline and the features, but just through the Indian slave trade too. Like you can't tell me that a lot of slaves because the Indian slave trade had a higher number than the Atlantic, you know. So you can't tell me that there weren't a lot of blacks there who weren't procreating with the natives that were already there.
Exactly. I don't
So
think that would be a wrong assumption to make at all.
just overall about our guy here. Speaking about nice little nuggets of knowledge, what does will I don't want to spoil it if it's something you'll go into eventually, but is if not, did you ever get into why the ash usage was a ritual of some sort?
As far as I could tell, it was just a practice in Japan at the time. Like you remember how we spoke on charcoal burners and stuff like that. It was a practice back then, but you will see later on how that isolation does play up into that because I do get a little more in depth into that story, and you see, oh, these guys just weren't used to people that weren't Japanese. They're only just now starting to get used to certain white people because of the Jesuits.
Speaking of some, nothing is new under the sun, because hearing what you say about the Jesuits, I think about how they're really the originators of what the Jehovah's Witnesses do today to a more extreme level.
Everything that any church does is basically based off of the best hits of the Catholic Church, really, honestly. And that's how you get Mormonism and the Jehovah's Witnesses, and stuff like that is they take the source code and then they alter it to form a new belief system. So a lot of that, the mission trips, all of that, I mean, why break it if it ain't broke and why fix it if it don't need it? If it's been around 2,000 years and still works for them. That's why
Hmm.
every church that's Christian does mission trips of some sort, whatever it may be.
That's honestly just a part of why it's hard to take them in particular serious because of it, you know? I mean, I don't know if there's any Jehovah's Witnesses listeners out there, but a lot of them try to use that as a source to say that this is how you tell that we're the right religion, basically, because we're doing what Jesus said to do, was just to go and preach the word. But it's like, yeah, lots of religions and denominations and shit are doing that in some form, you know, just
Not a
being
strong
real,
way to justify it.
you know what I mean? Like, don't want to, I mean, I'm not the type to be all PC. I mean, the Jehovah's Witnesses, listeners out there, if you're out there, you should be smart enough to use some use some discretion, but just got to keep it real.
That's very fair. But you'll see though how crazy it is that like we were saying before we were recording the show, how the Catholics really do have their hand in everything. And the weird part of it is you wouldn't have the first black samurai if it wasn't for the Catholics, like in a very literal way. You see, Yasuke spent 2 years in Kyushu, the southern island, protecting Velignano, as he toured the Christian daimyo territories. This period is crucial. This is where he learned Japanese. The Jesuits were obsessed with enculturation, adapting to local customs. Valignano wrote books on it. Living in this environment, Yasuke would have absorbed the language, the etiquette, and the social cues of the elite Japanese society. He wasn't a mute brute. He was becoming culturally bilingual. In March 1581, the mission arrived in Kyoto, the capital, and chaos ensued. The rumors of a giant black man had preceded them. The Japanese populace, who had never seen an African, went into a frenzy. Primary accounts describe a stampede at the Jesuit church, the Nananji. The doors were battered down. People were crushed to death in the ensuing rush just to get a glimpse of him. The noise was so loud it disturbed a nearby warlord garrisoned at Hanoji Temple. That warlord was Oda Nobunaga. Nobunaga is the most important figure in Japanese medieval history. He was the Demon King, the Dairokuten no Mao. He was a disruptor. He hated tradition. He burned down ancient Buddhist temples because the monks annoyed him. He embraced European guns, European clothes, and European wine. When he heard about the commotion, he didn't hide. He demanded to see the cause. On March 23rd, 1581, Yasuke stood before the Demon King.
Well, And this is something that I don't know, I guess in the midst of talking about other things, it kind of slipped my mind to bring up within the last segment. But it was, I guess everything happens for a reason because it's best for me to mention it now with what you were talking about, just enculturation and how he wasn't some just big mute brute, some Michael Orr from the Blind Side type of motherfucker. You know what I mean?
I feel you.
Like truthfully, because you say like the average height was like you said it was like what 5'2", and
He
he
was a good
was
foot
6'2".
taller.
So he's towering above everybody. Like he's this big black just giant, and without blending into the background off of just how different you look already, you really dip into the society and everything that's going on. And it brings me to what I said I wanted to say, which is it brings out and shows that within just being black, no matter the time or space, it kind of forces us to be bicultural, bilingual, uh, just to a certain degree. I know you probably remember the Dave Chappelle interview. It's called In the Actors Room or some shit like that. It's the old white guy with the bald spot, and he's interviewing Dave Chappelle, I
Hmm.
think, and he talks about how he he says a joke, kind of, you know how Dave Chappelle does about like very realistic things, and he says that all black people are bilingual. We know how to speak hanging with the homie, smoking a blunt, and we also know how to speak job interview type shit. Like it kind of forces you to being black in whatever society kind of forces you to know how to know how to move in different rooms and speak different languages to a degree or another, just based off of your very existence, you know, and that that's something that never leaves. That's something that I definitely picked up from his life.
I think you're spot on what you're observing here, and this is why I love having two different perspectives, man, because I think you're really bringing some stuff to the table that the average listener may not really realize. Like, these aren't people in history, these are people just like you that have gone through the same things you have.
Right, right, right. Just in that's definitely a common thread in the common thought, and it's apparent as ever. It's cool to see, especially from it's well, I won't say especially from a giant, but it does add some interest to it.
It does, and a smart giant at that, that this is a man that was playing 3D chess. Because this story does get brutal, it does get sad, but the one thing I can tell you by the end is he lives. And not a lot of people that slip into the court of kings as a commoner can ever really say that, you know? So the meeting between these two men is legendary. Nobunaga, a man of intense curiosity and skepticism, refused to believe Yasuke's skin color was natural. He thought it was a trick, ink or soot applied to the skin. He ordered Yasuke to strip to the waist and had his attendants scrub him with water and brushes. When the scrubbing only made his skin glisten with sweat, Nobunaga's skepticism turned to absolute delight. He realized this man was a natural marvel. The Shinchocho Kokai, the official chronicle of Nobunaga, refers to this moment. A black monk came from the Christian countries. He looks about 26 or 27 years of age. His entire body was black like that of an ox. The man was healthy and good looking. Moreover, his formidable strength surpassed that of 10 men. Note the respect in that description. Good looking, strength of 10 men. Nobunaga immediately asked Valignano to transfer Yasuke to his service. Valignano, desperate to curry favor with the man who held the fate of Christianity in his hands, agreed. This transfer changed Yasuke's legal status instantly. He went from being a Jesuit servant to a retainer of the Oda clan. Nobunaga gave him the name Yasuke. This wasn't just a nickname. In feudal Japan, receiving a name from a lord was a contract of vassalage. It legitimized him, and Nobunaga loved talking to him. Unlike the Jesuits, who were always trying to convert him or debate theology, Yasuke could tell stories, good stories. He would talk about elephants, about the savannah, about the great stone cities of India. He was a window into a wider world for a warlord who dreamed of conquering China.
Hmm. That's a pretty spectacular way of putting it, you know, because here you got this man who is literal proof of a world outside of your own. You know, he is literal flesh and blood proof of that. And he can tell you about that and about other places, you know, and very well speak your tongue very well, very properly, you know. It's a nice scene in a sense. You could say it's like he's a circus attraction, but not in a demeaning way. You know, because one example, speaking of Black history and shit like that, that's always brought up as a example of blacks being used as circus attractions. I'm sure you're familiar with the lady who was a slave and basically she had a gigantic ass, just to be blunt about it, and they kind of turned her around and put her on display. You know, had people come up and inspect it and shit. And with this, of course, this is a complete 180 from that. But it's like, look at this giant black man from this other land who can tell us about this. And he's visual evidence of people who look nothing like us and who live in ways that are different than us in more ways than one. And he's he's basically our shred of hope that for a world outside of this, you know.
And I think when you look at it, it did start off as curiosity. They were truly intrigued by this person that looks so different from anyone else they had seen. But I think as it progresses, what you're seeing here isn't necessarily a circus attraction in a good way. I'd liken it more to the most interesting man in the world. You know, that this guy's telling you about things that you couldn't even fantasize about because you had no reference point for it. He's telling you about magical sounding things that you couldn't even fathom. And so it goes from being, oh, this guy looks different. Let's see if he's really black and scrub him down to, dude, have you listened to his stories? This is the coolest dude in the world. Fuck those Jesuits, they're kind of boring. All that God talk, it's played out. But this dude, have you ever even heard about a lion? This shit's crazy.
Damn, I'm kind of remiss that I didn't even bring that up initially, you know, like scrubbing this motherfucker down to see if it was really him, you know. Yeah, I guess it's just the times, you know. It's definitely the times and the wonder on their face when they saw it was all him. I can only imagine, unfortunately.
Well, and not to downplay, because this is a problematic thing they did, but you got to look at it from this perspective that this man is used to liars, deceivers, cheats. He thinks this guy's making it up, and he just covered himself in ink, which was something you would have seen done back then. So once he scrubs him down and sees, okay, this dude's on the level. So the lions are real. So the savannah is real. So all of your military service is real. You are 6'2" and you served in the trenches. You're gonna be my right hand
Yeah.
man.
Yeah, and just to be all the way exact, I didn't necessarily look at it as something that was like super duper offensive, especially if it was something that like it could have happened. It was not unlikely from what you tell me how their society and shit was like, but just I mean, hell of a thought, and not even a thought. It's a hell of an experience that actually happened. Apparently, you know.
Well, and I'm saying it more for the listeners out there that keep in
Yeah.
mind there's a lot of people that hear this story and think, "Oh, as you made the comparison before, was he just a circus act for the Japanese court?" But as you'll see as we go on, he was respected for his competence, his strength, his size, which, yes, you could write it up to, well, these are just tiny little xenophobes. They're like, he's giant, he must be strong, but he is. And you see it played out where this guy's like, I don't care what color you are, I don't care where you're from. You have the strength of 10 men. You can yop a motherfucker's head off. And the other big difference is everyone in Japan is used to fighting other Japanese people. Samurai train for hours to learn how to fight against other samurai. There's a style to it. You're bringing in a man that's a competent warrior, that's the master of probably at least two or three different martial styles of war that nobody in Japan has ever seen. This guy becomes an asset immediately. And as we said, he speaks Japanese, guys, so keep that in mind too, that like it's not just that he's this giant strong guy. He sees the two like, oh, this dude is smarter than the people that brought him along. I'm going to keep him around because I respect his merit, not just the fact that he looks different.
Hmm. Hmm. And before you enlighten me, I'll just say I said about a guy that we spoke of not all too long ago. It was within this year at least. And I said that it's nice that he exists because he is an example of what you said Jesus would have to be if he actually existed, based on the fact that carpenters, as they say Jesus was, they had to do things differently than carpenters of today that required them to have a little muscle on them, you know? So if Jesus actually existed, for him to be a guy that preached about meekness and humility, he would it would be especially impressive in some people's eyes because he's a giant, and he's still meek and humble. And I guess we're digging through history and seeing that there's at least a couple, and I'm sure multiple people like that.
And I think a big part of it too, as you'll see as we move on here, I think a big part of it is definitely the fact that he could have taken that sword and chopped Oda's head off and run away and just gotten to do his own thing. But he really was there out of his own volition. And when he traded services, he found a man that didn't just give him freedom, he gave him a title. And I think that Yasuke truly did respect Nobunaga and valued the fact that he saw his worth in him. Because as you'll see, when people want to go, oh, he must have just been a sideshow at the court or something. No. Here's where we get into the controversy. Was Yasuke a samurai? The internet loves to argue about this, but if we look at the historical definitions of the Sengoku period, the answer is a resounding yes. In 1581, the class lines were fluid. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Nobunaga's greatest general, started as a peasant sandal bearer. Samurai wasn't just a bloodline, it was a job description. It meant you served sabura, a lord in the military or administrative capacity, and received a stipend. The records show Yasuke received exactly that. Fuchi stipend. He was granted a rice stipend. This is the economic marker of the warrior class, the bushi. Servants get fed, retainers get paid. The sayamaki, the sword. Nobunaga gifted him a short sword with a decorative sheath. In a society where carrying weapons in the presence of the hegemon was a capital offense for commoners, this was a massive privilege. Jesuit letters confirm he wore the daisho, the two swords, in public. There's also the shitaku, the residence. He was given a private house in Azuchi. Servants sleep on the floor of the master's quarters. Retainers have their own homes. And on Dogu Mochi, weapon bearer. This was his official role. He carried Nobunaga's weapons. This sounds menial to modern ears, but in feudal Japan it was a position of extreme trust. The man holding your spear is the last line of defense. This role was usually reserved for Kosho. elite pages from noble families who were the Lord's bodyguards, secretaries, and lovers. By making Yasuke his weapon bearer, Nobunaga was putting him in the inner circle, the Kinju. We even have a record of him on campaign. The Ietada Nikki, Diary of Matsudaira Ietada, records that on May 11th, 1582, Yasuke accompanied Nobunaga on inspection tour of the defeated Takada lands near Mount Fuji. Ietada, a veteran samurai, notes his presence, his stipend, and his appearance. He doesn't call him a slave. He treats him as a curiosity, but a peer in the retinue. Yasuke wasn't a palace pet. He was a mobilized soldier living in Azuchi Castle, the most magnificent fortress in Japan.
Hmm. I like the delineation there, you know, just how you lay it out who he is. And it kind of reminds me of a distinction between two characters within a similar universe. And I'll say that because remember when we spoke about the newer Fresh Prince of Bel-Air remake, you know,
Yes,
the
yes.
adaptation, yeah, the adaptation of the old show. So, of course, in the older show, you have Jeffrey the butler, who is just a typical run-of-the-mill butler, right? But in the newer show, I remember, and you kind of laughed about it. Jeffrey, he's this, he's this kind of jacked, kind of buffer, more more younger version of what Jeffrey would have been, you know. And he's more of a confidant for Uncle Phil, you know, within that one. You know, like I don't even think he's a butler or anything. I don't think even think he cleans a bit, but he's just Uncle Phil's right hand man, and anything he needs, he got it. I remember, and this is where the laughing came in at. He didn't kill. He didn't do the killing himself, but he arranged for the guy that Will got into a fight with that sent him to California. He arranged for him to be killed, like all types of crazy shit. And that's like the distinction here between what people would think about who he was and who he really was, you know. I mean, at the end of the day, are you gonna ask anybody to hold your gun for you that you don't trust, that's not in your inner circle? You know what I mean? Like that's all the sense in the world to me. And that was definitely the equivalent of the times of a gun.
That is definitely the best comparisons you could give. And you're dead accurate that if he didn't trust this dude, he wouldn't have given him a sword. He wouldn't have let him near him when he slept. He wouldn't have given him castles and money and honor and a title. Like, this man literally did a glow up here in Japan for, a little while. And it had to be amazing for him too, because it goes both ways. From the stories I've read and stuff, it feels like Yasuke, as you'll see, really did feel a loyalty to Oda because there's times where he could have run from Nobunaga when things got hard, when the fight came to the door, and instead of doing that, he stands by this man. Spoilers a little bit here till the very end. And I think that speaks volumes to how they both viewed each other. From what I was reading, they loved hanging out with each other. They loved talking shop. They just loved kicking it and going riding around, taking over Japan. So I think that is an excellent comparison, and I think that really should help people understand. Like, this dude wasn't just some guy. He was the inner circle of the inner circle. I have the knife to your throat if I want to.
And this isn't really a side note, but you can only wonder what he thought to himself. I'm sure there was an extreme amount of self-pride that he was able to turn his circumstances out to what I think is obviously the best possible circumstances that could be, you know.
And I want you to hold that thought as we continue through this and think about, because I felt that same thought reading his stuff. And then when you see how it ends, I've kind of wondered what was in his head too. And we'll get there here. So that glory he had, it was incredibly short-lived. The year 1582 was the year of the cataclysm. By June, Nobunaga was at the peak of his power. He controlled the capital. His enemies were crushed. He was preparing to invade the west. He moved a small administrative force to Kyoto and stayed at Honnoji Temple. He felt safe, but he was wrong. One of his top generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, betrayed him. Fun fact, as you see how this will shake out, Mitsuhide does succeed in what he does in getting rid of Nobunaga. But Mitsuhide is known as the 13-Day Emperor. His reign lasted 13 days. When everyone figured out the sneaky shit he was doing, they came down on him like hail on a fucking sidewalk and chased his ass out of town. He was jumped by a bandit who saw a fleeing samurai and wanted his armor and killed him on the spot for it. So, keep that in mind because sometimes that pendulum of justice swings where it needs to. So, on the night of June 20th, Akeche took an army of 13,000 men, supposedly marching west to fight the Mori clan, and turned them back toward Kyoto. The enemy is at Honaiji, he declared. In the pre-dawn darkness, Akechi's troops surrounded the temple. Nobunaga had maybe 30 to 70 men, with Yasuke there. The attack was a massacre. The defenders were outnumbered 200 to 1. But they fought. Nobunaga's young pages, led by Mori Ranmaru, held the line to buy their master time. Yasuke fought. But contrary to some pop culture myths, he was not the Kaikachukunin, the second, who cut off Nobunaga's head. When the temple was engulfed in flames and Nobunaga committed seppuku in the back room to avoid capture, the fight at Hanaji was over.
Before I go on, why do you think the pop culture myths point towards the theory that it was him that cut off Nobunaga's head?
I think the answer for that is twofold. One, it makes for a much more dramatic story, but two, with the trust and loyalty he had between him and Nobunaga, it also, I guess, kind of adds to the first one as well. It makes for a better story, but it also was a way of saying, look how loyal they were, how loyal he was, how close they were. Because to be the second, it's like we said, he gave you the knife for a reason. When it's time to use it, he expects you to use it. It was weirdly a sort of honor, if one could call it that, at the time in Japan.
Okay, I dig it. I dig it. I dig it. And just overall, it's a tragic story, but I think we both agree it's a fairly typical story within the realms of history. You know, his one of his top generals betraying him, yada yada. I mean, it's it's kind of as repetitive as a Tyler Perry movie as far as history goes, if you want to give a comparison, truthfully.
It is an old
But
formula, but you start to see how do you think it affected Yasuke though? You know what I mean? That you were this guy's bodyguard your whole life. You were maybe not necessarily always a bodyguard, but when you were a bodyguard, you were the best goddamn bodyguard there was. And you failed.
yeah, I think I think it was definitely a realm of shock with him, but all in all, I think it's a safe bet that Yasuke knew enough to know that he lived in a pretty treacherous world and things like that kind of came with the territory, unfortunately.
That is fair, but you start to see too because that bodyguard instinct doesn't necessarily turn off, and this is what I was referring to earlier with at that point when Hanujai Temple was raised and done for and the fight was done, this is where Yasuke makes a decision that proves that loyalty. He didn't flee into the night. He didn't run back to the Jesuits. He ran to the Nijo Shin Gosho, the Nijo New Palace, located a short distance away. This was the resident of Oda Nobunaga's of Oda Nobunaga. Oda Nobunaga, Nobunaga's eldest son and heir. Why? Because in the samurai code, when the lord dies, your allegiance transfers to the heir. Yasuke was fulfilling his duty. He joined Nobunaga's garrison. The Battle of Nijo Castle was even more intense, though, than Hanoji. Nobunaga had about 1,500 men, but the full weight of the Akechi army, over 10,000 troops, descended upon them. The fighting was hand to hand. The Jesuit historian Louis Frau, writing shortly after, explicitly states Yasuke fought for a long time. Pilau muerto tempo. He wasn't hiding. He was on the rampart swinging a sword, defending the heir of the Oda clan. Eventually, the defense collapsed. Nobutada committed suicide. Yasuke was one of the last men standing. He was approached by Akechi's samurai. Here, the cultural programming diverged. A Japanese samurai in that position would likely have cut open his belly to avoid the shame of capture. Yasuke, perhaps because he was Christian, or perhaps because he was a pragmatist who had survived the slave trade, surrendered his sword. He chose life.
It's nice that the examples of just how it's just ingrained in Asian culture that surrendering is just a no-go. Examples of that just never stop popping up, you know? Like cutting open your own stomach to avoid capture, like, god damn. Talk about intense.
Very much so. And that was a part of that Bushido we were talking on before that Saigo Takamori had. That's why he led that charge and let himself get shot down to death knowing he couldn't win. That's why the kamikazes in World War II crashed their planes into boats. Bushido, part of the way of the warrior, is literally that cowardice is worse than death. So why not give your life for something honorable?
He could have fled, but going from it it just shows that a lot of people would have easily said some stuff or just rationalized that it was just business between them anyway. So he can flee into the night if he really wants to, and nobody can actually look at him a certain way. But it shows that his heart was in certain things, you know.
It does. He really did have a loyalty to Nobunaga because the man really did see him for his worth. He wasn't just some big, strong wall he could stand up in front of people. He was a person that these guys genuinely liked and respected. And sadly, I hate to be the guy to make the story even more sad. That loyalty is amazing. It's an awesome thing to see. But here's where the story gets really kind of fucked up. Yasuke was bound and dragged before the traitor Akichi Mitsuhide. This moment is the climax of the story. Mitsuhide had to decide what to do with the black samurai. Mitsuhide looked at him and delivered a verdict that has been analyzed for centuries. He said, "The black man is a beast and knows nothing. He is not Japanese, so do not kill him. Place him in the Padres' church." On the surface, this is a racist insult. He called him a beast, he dehumanized him. But if you look deeper, this was likely a calculated act of mercy disguised as contempt. If Mitsuhide had acknowledged Yasuke as a samurai, he would have been obligated to force him to commit seppuku or execute him as a warrior. By labeling him a beast or non-Japanese, he created a loophole. He exempted Yasuke from death that was demanded by the samurai code of culpability. Also, Mitsuhide was in a precarious political position. He had just killed the most powerful man in Japan. Did he really want to antagonize the Jesuits and potentially the Portuguese Navy by executing their former property? Probably not. It was a political release valve. But let's be honest, I say property. The crazy thing is, the Jesuits loved him just as much as Nobunaga. When he got back to their care, the last record we have of him is a Jesuit letter that says, "We are thanking God beyond all for letting Yasuke return to us safely." Yasuke was escorted to the Jesuit church, the Nanbenji, in Kyoto. The last primary source we have is that letter from Louis Fra, November 5th, 1582, thanking God Yasuke did not lose his life. And then silence. He vanishes from history. Did he go back to India? Did he die of wounds? Did he become a gunner for another warlord in Kyushu? As one obscure record from 1584 suggests, we don't know. We do know that sometimes disappearing from history is the ultimate win, though. No matter the outcome of his final days, they were lived on his terms, with a few good stories for the bar.
Interesting to say the very least. And speaking of just overall explaining things for the listeners and stuff, just overall, really, I think it's probably because I mean, as legit as it is that those can still be classified as racist statements or whatever, the fact that he actually believed that and he actually had those sentiments about black people, the possibility that he actually felt that that was the case and he felt that he was being sympathetic and not racist is still a is it's still a possibility. So I can I guess I can see the logic in that. But overall, it's really it's speaking of episodes and stuff, because this is of course an episode of a show. Is you know those stories? It's kind of giving me the whole Johnny Lovely vibes from the Proud Family, like a this mythical character who just disappears into nowhere, and we never hear from him ever again. You know, shit like that. It's a real classic sentiment, and what a better way to end your story with a guy like this.
And now, before we get to my Jerry Springer moment here, let me ask this, because this is something I've been trying to process and ponder about the last few weeks with this story. How do you think Yasuke felt at the end of his life? Do you think he felt bad he couldn't have done more in Japan? Do you think he felt happy that he was able to leave with his life? Do you think he was like, cool, I was a samurai for a little bit, I was in the imperial court, and now I can go be a general in an army somewhere else?
I mean, there's no doubt that he had to be proud to have his life at least, you know. But I know for a fact I'm sure he wished that there was more that more that could have been done. That's that's a fair statement.
That's a good way to look at it, and it's a really human way to look at it. Because, yet again, as we say all the time, part of what we're doing here is to show you this guy, like you said, sounds like Johnny Lovely. Sounds like somebody we made up on the spot if it wasn't a true story. But
Mhm.
as crazy and legendary and mythical as it may be, this was a man that lived just the same as us, and he had the same hopes and dreams and fears as us. Either way, his legacy remains. He was the Obsidian Samurai, a man who proved that in the chaos of the Sengoku period, ability mattered more than origin. He was a slave who became a sword bearer, a foreigner who fought for the heart of Japan, and in a world of rigid hierarchies, he broke every rule just by existing. Take care of yourselves and remember, everybody, history is always stranger than fiction. Mr. Talberto, any closing thoughts? Anything you'd like to plug? Anything you'd like to tell these beautiful listeners?
You know, I think everything was wrapped up nice and tightly. Other than that, It's been a hell of a blast. And TOLBERT Simpsons, the Insta handle. It's more and more of a party there every fucking day. And I'm loving it. Believe the Cheese, world's most dangerous podcast. Out this bitch. See you
S-
next time.
See you next week, ladies and gentlemen, when we tackle the first serial killer in history, and it ain't who you think it is.